Welcome to the very first, the second PowerPoint that will be going in Year 11 Biology, but it's really the very first PowerPoint that's going to have a little bit of content for us to look at some real biology stuff. And the first area that we're going to look at in bio is all about cell sizes, cell structure, and cell function. Okay, why cells? Because cells are the smallest breakdown of a living thing. All right, something's not living if it doesn't have cells, and we'll talk about that later on in biology. All right, and hopefully by the end of this class, when you do draw a plant cell and identify its most important parts, you're not drawing a cell, a plant like a flower inside a cell. You know? All right, so in our study design, make sure that you aren't losing this and you're always ticking off areas as we go, especially because it's going to help you highlight the key points that you're missing out on, and it's going to help you in study later on. But we're going to look at cells as the basic structural feature of life on Earth. Right, including the distinction between what we have prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. They're the two big groupings of cells. And we're also going to talk about surface area to volume ratio as an important factor in explaining the limitations of cell size and the need for internal compartments, which we call organelles, with specific cellular functions. All right? It's a little bit of maths that we're going to do in biology. Luckily, we don't talk about too much maths in biology, but today we are going to talk about a little bit of simple maths. So what's cell theory? All right, the cell theory states that all organisms are made up of cells. All of those cells come from pre-existing cells, and that the cell is the smallest living organizational unit. All right, so here we have, which is a single-celled organism. It's still made up of a cell, and this cell came from a past amoeba. All right. Over here, hopefully you can recognize, is an elephant, all right? And in an elephant, we have trillions and trillions of cells, and all of those cells came from other cells, which initially came from this elephant's mother and father cells, all right, which came from their mother and father cells, and you can actually trace cells back all the way back to the very first cell to exist, all right? So what is a cell? In definition, a cell is the smallest structural and functional unit from which all living things are built, okay? And how do we know about cell theory is based on detailed microscopic and biochemical observations, all right? So both looking through a microscope, but also looking at the biochemical nature, so the living chemistry of living things. Okay, so inside your human body, you have about 37.2 trillion cells, take or give a few million, all right? And when you place those cells end to end, all right, you'd see each cell is only 2 microns wide, all right? But if you were to place every single one of those cells end to end, you would actually circle the Earth twice. Right? Well, 1.5 times. So you've had 40,075 kilometers worth of cells. So lots and lots of cells. How do we know about cells? Is because of this Englishman that we call Robert Hooke. Right? And in the year 1665, he actually named cells, all right, and he actually saw cells under this new instrument that we now call a microscope, all right. So in the experiment, what he did was he actually cut very thin slices of cork, just like cork we use for wine bottles, and he looked at these slices under a microscope, and he saw tiny box-like structures. So can you see that this structure here is made up of tiny little boxes, right? And they actually reminded him of small rooms that monks used to live in those times, and he called those cells. They're actually not cells, they're just the outline, the cell wall of the cells that used to live there. Those cells had actually died, but that name stuck. So what's the common feature? Every single cell, doesn't matter what kind it is, has a plasma membrane. All right, and that's this membrane on the outside of the cell, and it's going to be really important in the next area topic that we cover, right? And we also call this a cell membrane. The plasma membrane encloses what we call the cytoplasm. You might also see this called the cytosol, which is pretty much the same thing. Cytosol just means it's the liquid. All right, cytoplasm is the liquid with all the stuff inside. All right, and also all cells have some kind of genetic material which we represent. Usually it's in the middle, right? And this can be either RNA or the more familiar for you guys, DNA. Okay. All right, so What about prokaryotes? Okay, so prokaryotes is the first major grouping of cells, and they include the bacteria, which we really care about, and these other guys called cyanobacteria, and they're tiny, all right? And I know when we talk about cells, we're always talking about tiny, but prokaryotes are extremely, extremely small. Okay, they lack membrane-bound organelles, so pretty much we have this outer membrane of the cell, but inside everything's just floating around the cytoplasm. Okay, and they contain a single circular chromosome. So this purple structure here is what's the chromosome, and if as much as it's all wound up, if you were to unwind it, it would form a circle, okay? And remember, that's different from our chromosome as eukaryotes because that's a linear chromosome. The plasma membrane, it's surrounded by an extra layer, which we call a cell wall, and that cell wall is made up of protein and complex carbohydrates, and it's just to protect the bacteria a little bit more. All right? And you also might find different structures in bacteria, such as these flagella that help it move, the pili, all right? Lots and lots of different structures. Notice that bacterial cells, like prokaryotes, they don't have a nucleus, but they do have what we call a nucleoid. That's the region where we'll find the chromosome. And they do have these structures, these organelles, not membrane-bound, they are organelles, those, and we call them ribosomes. And they're going to be really, really important in making proteins later on. What about eukaryotes, all right? So prokaryotes, pro means before, so they're the living things that are ancient, okay? They were the first living thing. Eukaryotes, that's us, okay? They have an internal membrane system forming a nuclear membrane, all right? So they have what we call the nucleus, okay? And so inside a eukaryote, you've got all of these membrane-bound structures, all right? And it's really, really important because it means that eukaryotes can be really specific and they can do really complex things, okay? Types of eukaryotes are plants, animals, fungi, protists, and bacteria. Eukaryotes are going to be the biggest focus inside biology. Just a comparison of eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Hopefully you can see that there's a lot of similarities. They both have that plasma membrane, cytoplasm, DNA, the nuclear region, which we either call the nucleus if it's a eukaryote, or nucleoid if it's a prokaryote, and they all have these ribosomes, very important. And also, as you can see, prokaryotes, very tiny. There's a scale, 0.1 to 10 nanometers. Eukaryotes, the smallest eukaryotes are bigger than the largest prokaryotes, okay? And they're very much more complex, as you can see. All right, so let's talk about this thing that we call surface area versus volume ratio. How does this work is that as a cell increases in both their surface areas, as a cell increases, both the surface area and the volume increases, but not at the same rate. All right. So if the shape of a cell doesn't change, the volume, the amount of cytoplasm that's inside, actually increases faster than the surface area, the amount of plasma membrane that's outside. All right. And that's going to be a big issue for a cell, but let's draw this out really quick. So if we had a cell that's a perfect cube, obviously a cell like this doesn't exist, but this perfect cube cell had a side length of 1. Okay, and then it had another cell that was a little bit bigger, and it was also a perfect cube cell, and its side length was 2. And then if we had the same cell that once again bigger, and it had a side length of 3, all of these are perfect cube cells. Let's see what would happen to their surface areas and their volumes. All right. First of all, the surface area of each of these cells, all right, we'd find that. All right, so this cell would have each side would be 1 by 1, so that's 1 maybe centimeter squared. All right, so it'd be 1 times 6 gives us a surface area of 6 centimeters squared. All right, this one here, it'd be 2 by 2, so this time each side would actually be 4 centimeters squared, so 4 by 6 gives us 24 centimeter squared. And lastly, this one here, each side is 3 by 3, so that's 9, so 9 by 6 gives us 27, oh no, not 27, bad maths, 54 centimeters squared. Cool. So there's the surface areas. What about their volumes? All right, the volume's a little bit easier to calculate. It's just 1 by 1 by 1. So that one is 1 centimeters cubed. And this one's 2 by 2 by 2. So that one's just 8 centimeters cubed. And lastly, we have 3 by 3 by 3, 27 centimeters cubed. Cool. So what's the ratio? So the surface area to volume ratio for each one of these. This one here is pretty easy. So the surface area is 6, but the volume is 1, so a 6-to-1 ratio. This one here, 24 divided by 8, actually gives us 3, so we have a surface area to volume ratio of 3-to-1. And then here, if we did 54 divided by 27, that gives us a surface area to volume ratio of 2-to-1. Do you have to do this, maths? No, you don't have to do this, maths. You just have to understand this concept, okay? Because what's important here is if you look at these numbers, as this cell gets bigger, so as we go from this end to this end, the surface area to volume ratio gets smaller. These two numbers get closer together. Why is that important? Is because how does a cell talk? How does a cell do anything with its environment? Is through its surface. Okay, things come in and out of a cell through its surface. So if this number is closer, that means that this cell can't provide for its insides as much. And this gives us the reason to why cells are very small. All right. But there's also a few cells that get around this in some ways. The first way that cells get around this is through altering their shape. All right, they actually come in thinner shapes, such as the lining of the small intestines, and that means that these cells can specialize to have a greater surface area without significant increases to their volume. Because, and what I want you to remember is that we don't want to increase volume because that makes it harder for a cell to do its job. So, how do intestine cells look? They actually look something like this. All right, that's what an intestinal cell is. All right, and what does that mean? So this intestinal cell, let's say it's got its nucleus and its all organelles in here, but it's got all of this extra space now, all of this extra surface up here that it can exchange stuff with its environment. And that's what your intestine does. It's constantly taking in nutrients in your intestine. So as the food passes down your intestine, that food's going to come into your intestinal cells like this. All right, and that's really handy because we've increased surface area without big increases to volume. Okay. Another example of this kind of cell is your neurons, right? What do your neurons sort of look like? Nothing like this, but Mr. Mellor can't draw, right? But your neurons look a bit like this, and they've got long, long structures, increasing their surface areas without increasing their volume, okay? So, eukaryotes actually have one extra solution, and this is a really awesome solution, and they're called membrane-bound organelles. All right, so not all cells in your body can have such thin shapes. All right, so what these eukaryotic cells do is they have specialized organelles that's bound by very similar membranes to the outside of the cell. So the plasma membrane that's on the outside, it's got very similar structure to organelles such as the mitochondria that's on the inside of the cell. All right, and that means that these special organelles, such as the mitochondria, right, they can do special jobs such as cellular respiration for the mitochondria, or if you're the Golgi apparatus, you can do a special job such as the packaging of proteins, all right, or if you're the chloroplast, you can do the special jobs such as photosynthesis, all right? So all these special jobs can only happen because we have these membrane-bound organelles. And what they're essentially doing is increasing surface area of a cell. So they're increasing the amount of plasma membrane we're getting without increasing that volume, okay? And that's all. Make sure you do the 3 quick questions, and we'll check them in class.